December 17, 1944, Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Corporal Joe Miller lay flat behind a frozen embankment 60 yards from the tree line, watching the wood line shift. Not the trees. What was moving between them? His squad, 7 men, had been in position for less than 4 hours. Reinforcements were 11 miles east. Command had not checked in. Miller was 22 years old. He had been passed over for sergeant twice. No one above him believed this position could hold. They weren't wrong to doubt it. What they were wrong about was him. What happened over the next 48 hours was not recorded in the headline dispatches. It was documented quietly in a 3-page after-action report filed 9 days after the fact, by the men who survived it. This is that account. And to understand what Miller did in those 48 hours, you first have to understand what kind of soldier they thought he was and why they were wrong. Corporal Joe Miller was assigned to the 99th Infantry Division, 394th Infantry Regiment, United States Army. He had been in Europe since October 1944, roughly 10 weeks by the time the Ardennes offensive began. On paper, that made him experienced enough to know the terrain, and green enough to be considered expendable in the planning stages of any serious operation. His commanding officers had not flagged him for advancement, not because he had failed anything, but because he had not distinguished himself in any way they recognized. That distinction matters. Miller had grown up in rural Pennsylvania, small town, narrow roads, dense woodland that ran for miles without a break. His father had worked timber. Miller had worked alongside him from the age of 9, learning without knowing he was learning how forest terrain behaves, how sound travels differently through frozen trees than through summer canopy, how a man moving through underbrush at night creates a pattern of disturbance that a trained eye can read from 80 yards out, how elevation and tree density affect line of sight in ways that no field manual had yet put into plain language. None of that was on his service record. What was on his record? Qualified marksman. Basic infantry training, Fort Meade, Maryland. No commendations, no disciplinary actions. A single notation from a training officer in September 1943 that read, "In full, performs adequately, lacks initiative in group settings." That notation followed him. In the 394th, Miller was regarded the way most junior corporals are regarded in a division that had yet to see serious combat, as a body in a position useful for holding ground that no one expected to need to hold. His squad leader, Sergeant Raymond Carver, was 5 years older and had completed ranger training before a knee injury reclassified him to standard infantry. Carver was well-liked, vocal, the kind of NCO who filled silence with certainty, and whose certainty, in the absence of combat experience, became its own form of authority. Carver did not dislike Miller, he simply did not think about him very much. This was common. In the informal hierarchy of a rifle squad, Miller occupied the middle distance, present, reliable, unremarkable. He did not complain, he did not volunteer opinions during briefings. When other men debated tactics over cold rations, Miller listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was usually to ask a question that no one had thought to ask yet, the kind of question that produced a brief silence, then a redirect, because the answer was inconvenient. In late November 1944, during a patrol exercise near the Belgian border, Miller had raised a concern about the squad's noise discipline during movement through forested terrain. He had suggested a modified spacing interval, wider than regulation, adjusted for the acoustic properties of the specific woodland they were moving through. Carver had acknowledged the suggestion with a nod and proceeded with standard spacing. The exercise was completed without incident. Miller's suggestion was not revisited. It was also not forgotten by Miller. He began making small adjustments on his own, not dramatic ones. He modified the way he packed his kit to reduce rattle. He adjusted his movement cadence when crossing frost-hardened ground. He spent time, during rest periods, observing the wood lines around their positions, not casually, but with the specific attention of a man cataloging information he expected to use. Other men in the squad noticed this habit and found it mildly strange. One of them, Private First Class Dennis Houck, referred to Miller as the Watcher, not with admiration. Miller did not respond to this. He continued watching. By early December 1944, the 99th Division had settled into defensive positions along an 18-mile front in the Ardennes. The line was thin. Divisional command had assessed the sector as a quiet zone, a rest area for a green division, a place to acclimatize before deployment to a more active front. The assessment was not unreasonable given available intelligence. It was, as events would prove, catastrophically wrong. Miller's squad was positioned at a forward outpost, approximately 600 yards ahead of the main defensive line. The position offered good observation of the tree line to the northeast. It offered very little cover, and it was considered, by the officers who assigned it, to be low priority. A listening post, not a fighting position. 7 men, 1 corporal, minimal resupply, 11 miles from the nearest armored support. The assignment had been given because the position needed a body. Miller had been given it because no one had a stronger reason to give it to someone else. That is how the most consequential 48 hours of the Ardennes campaign, at least from the perspective of one forward outpost, came to rest entirely on the shoulders of a man his own unit had not yet bothered to evaluate. But before anyone could question the assignment, the Ardennes made the question irrelevant because on the morning of December 16th, the Germans didn't wait for anyone to be ready. On December 16th, the German military launched Operation Autumn Mist. The offensive the Allies would come to call the Battle of the Bulge. It began with artillery. Approximately 1,600 German guns opened simultaneously along an 85-mile front. The barrage lasted 2 hours. When it stopped, the silence it left behind was not relief. It was the sound of what was coming next. What was coming was 200,000 German soldiers and nearly 600 tanks, the last major strategic offensive the Wehrmacht would attempt on the Western Front. Hitler had staked everything on a single calculation: that a fast, concentrated thrust through the Ardennes could split the Allied line, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace before the Eastern Front collapsed entirely. The calculation was not irrational. The terrain favored it. The timing, winter, low visibility, Allied air support grounded by cloud cover, favored it. And the sector they had chosen to strike first favored it most of all. The 99th Infantry Division was directly in the path. The 99th had approximately 15,000 men spread across that 18-mile front. Against them came elements of the 6th Panzer Army. Among the most experienced armored formations, the Germans had left. The disparity was not simply numerical, it was structural. The 99th was a defensive infantry division occupying a line designed for observation, not sustained combat. Their positions had been built for a quiet sector: shallow foxholes, limited wire, fields of fire that assumed a threat level that no longer existed. Within the first 6 hours, the German advance had penetrated the line in multiple locations. Command attempted to respond with standard protocols. Units were ordered to hold in place, while reserves were redirected. Artillery was called to pre-registered coordinates. Runners were dispatched along routes that, in several cases, were already compromised. Telephone lines, the primary communication infrastructure along the front, had been cut by German infiltrators before the artillery began. Radio traffic was jammed intermittently. By midday on December 16th, several forward positions had lost contact with battalion headquarters entirely. Miller's outpost was one of them. The communication failure was not an isolated incident. It was a deliberate element of German operational planning. Wehrmacht commanders had studied Allied communication patterns along the Ardennes front for weeks. They knew which relay points were critical. They knew which lines ran above ground and were therefore vulnerable. German Special Operations Units, many in American uniforms, driving captured American vehicles, had moved through the sector in the pre-dawn hours, cutting lines and misdirecting traffic. By the time the main assault began, the Allied command structure along the front was not broken, but it was fractured. Operating on partial information, issuing orders to units it could not confirm had received them. The standard response to a fractured command structure is to push authority downward. Junior officers and NCOs are expected to exercise initiative within their last known orders. This is doctrine. What doctrine does not account for is a situation in which the junior NCO in question has 7 men, a position with minimal overhead cover, no armor support, no confirmed flanking units, and an enemy force of unknown size moving toward him through dense forest in deteriorating weather. The problem was not simply that Miller's position was exposed. Forward outposts are, by definition, exposed. The problem was that every conventional mechanism for addressing that exposure had been systematically removed. Reinforcement required communication. Communication was down. Withdrawal required authorization. Authorization required contact with battalion. Contact with battalion was gone. Mutual support from adjacent units required knowing where those units were. By late afternoon on December 16th, Miller did not know where his nearest friendly unit was. He knew where it had been. That was not the same information. 2 positions similar to Miller's, located roughly a mile to the north and south, along the same forward line, had already been overrun by nightfall on the 16th. The details of what happened at those positions were not confirmed until days later. What was confirmed was the result. No survivors reached friendly lines from either location. The German advance through the Ardennes was not merely a frontal assault. It was a methodical dismantling of the Allied ability to respond. Each position that fell made the next one easier to isolate. Each communication line cut made it harder for command to understand what was happening, let alone direct a coherent defense. The Germans were not just attacking ground. They were attacking the structure that made organized resistance possible. And that structure, by the evening of December 16th, had been reduced, at Miller's position, to 7 men, a corporal with no radio contact, and whatever ammunition they had drawn 3 days prior. No resupply had been scheduled. None was coming. Command was not ignoring the forward outposts. Command, in several critical cases, simply did not know they were still there. Miller knew, and sometime before last light on December 16th, he made a decision that would define the next 48 hours, not because it was heroic, but because it was the only decision that made any tactical sense. The last light on December 16th came, and within 20 minutes the forest was operationally black. No moon that evening. Cloud cover complete. Temperature falling through the low 20s Fahrenheit, with a wind from the northeast that had been steady since mid-morning and showed no indication of shifting. Miller noted all of this. He did not write it down. There was no formal log being kept at the outpost. That would have required communication with battalion, and battalion was unreachable. What Miller did instead was spend the final 30 minutes of usable light conducting a systematic observation of every approach to their position. He moved to each corner of the perimeter in sequence. He noted which directions offered concealed movement to an approaching force and which did not. He noted where the frozen ground would carry sound and where the wind would absorb it. He noted 2 positions, one at the northeast edge of the tree line, one along a shallow drainage ditch running south-southeast, where he assessed enemy movement to be most probable. Then he called his 7 men together. What he said to them was not recorded verbatim. What is known, from the after-action statements of the survivors, is that he did not make a speech. He gave assignments. He told each man where he would be, what he would watch, and under what specific conditions he was authorized to fire. He established a signal, 2 short clicks on a rifle sling buckle, for contact without sound. He told them that no one would fire without either that signal or a direct visual confirmation at close range. He told them that noise discipline was now their primary weapon. One of the men, Private Houck, the same man who had called Miller the Watcher 6 weeks earlier, asked what they were supposed to do if the Germans came in force. Miller told him they would handle that when it happened. That was the entirety of the briefing. The night of December 16th passed in intervals. Not quietly. The broader front was audible throughout. Artillery rolling in the middle distance. Occasional small arms fire carried on the wind from the north and south. But at the outpost itself, nothing moved. Miller rotated the men through watch in 2-hour intervals, keeping himself on continuous observation from the northeast-facing position he had identified as the primary approach. He did not sleep. There is no record that he attempted to. On December 17th, he heard something. It was not dramatic. It was a single compression of frozen undergrowth, the specific sound of a boot sole pressing through a crust of surface ice into the leaf matter beneath. One step, then nothing. Miller did not move. He did not signal. He waited. 40 seconds later, he heard it again. Closer. Same direction. Northeast tree line, consistent with the approach corridor he had identified the previous evening. He estimated the sound at 55 to 60 yards. He clicked the buckle twice. The man on his left, Private First Class Arthur Sims, shifted position without sound. Miller held up 2 fingers, pointed northeast, held up 1 finger to indicate a single contact. Sims acknowledged. Neither man raised a weapon. What came out of the tree line, 90 seconds later, was a single German soldier moving in a low crouch, crossing the open ground between the trees, and Miller did not fire. He did not signal. Miller did not fire. He did not signal anyone to fire. He waited, motionless, breathing controlled, while the scout held position for approximately 4 minutes. Then the scout withdrew, back into the tree line. No sound after that. Miller waited another 20 minutes before speaking. Then he quietly repositioned 2 of his men to cover the northeastern approach at tighter angles, reducing the blind spot he had identified during the scout's withdrawal route. He adjusted the southern watch interval to account for the possibility that the scout's approach had been a deliberate draw, designed to fix their attention north while a secondary element probed south. Nothing came from the south that night. Miller conducted a brief perimeter check. In the frozen mud at the northeastern edge of the open ground, he found boot prints. 1 set, approaching. 1 set, withdrawing. The stride pattern on the withdrawal was slightly longer than on the approach, consistent with a man moving faster than he wanted to appear to be moving. The scout had seen something that concerned him. Miller looked at the prints for a moment. Then he went back to his position. He had confirmed 2 things in the space of 1 night. The Germans knew the outpost was there, and they did not yet know what they were dealing with. That gap, between what the Germans knew and what they didn't, was the only resource Miller had left. But a scout reports back, and what that scout reported changed the nature of what was coming next. The scout had gone back with information. That was the problem. A single soldier probing a forward position in the dark is a reconnaissance asset. His job is not to engage, it is to observe, assess, and return. What he carries back is more valuable than anything he could accomplish alone. And what this particular scout had carried back was a specific piece of intelligence. The outpost was still occupied, still alert, and had not fired when given the opportunity. That last detail was the dangerous one. A position that doesn't fire when it has a shot is either undisciplined or deliberate. German infantry commanders in the Ardennes had enough combat experience to know the difference. An undisciplined position fires early, reveals itself, and can be fixed and flanked. A deliberate position, one that holds fire, controls its signature, and forces the attacker to operate without confirmed information, is a different problem entirely. It requires a different solution. They sent a different solution. Miller heard movement from two directions simultaneously. Northeast, as before, and now southeast, the drainage ditch he had identified on the first evening, and adjusted his southern watch to cover. The movements were not synchronized accidentally. The intervals between sounds were too consistent, the approach angles too deliberately separated. This was a coordinated probe. Two elements, moving in parallel, designed to split the defender's attention and force a response that would reveal the position's strength and orientation. Miller did not respond. He passed the two-click signal down the line and held every man in place. The approach continued for 6 minutes. Both elements closed to within 40 yards before stopping. There was a long pause, the kind of pause that happens when a forward element waits for a signal from the other side that doesn't come. Then both withdrew. No shots fired. No position revealed. But Miller understood what had just happened. The probe had not been designed to take the position. It had been designed to count them, to draw fire, assess the number of weapons, identify the defensive orientation, and report back. The fact that it had failed did not mean it would not be tried again, differently. He called Sims and Carver's replacement. Sergeant Carver had been separated from the position during the initial German advance and had not returned. A temporary acting sergeant named Kowalski over to his position. Miller laid out what he assessed was happening. He told them the next contact would not be a probe. He told them to expect a direct approach, probably at night, probably from the northeast with a secondary element, pinning from the southeast to prevent withdrawal. Kowalski asked how he knew. Miller said he didn't know. He said it was what he would do. That was the shift. The first night had been about observation and restraint. Now it was about anticipating a thinking enemy, one that had gathered information and was in the process of converting it into a plan. Miller was no longer simply reacting to terrain and weather. He was reacting to an opponent who was adjusting in real time. He made 3 changes. First, he repositioned the 2 men covering the northeastern approach, moving them back 6 yards and angling their fields of fire to intersect rather than run parallel. This reduced their individual exposure and created a crossfire corridor that an approaching force would enter without knowing it. Second, he had the drainage ditch covered not from the near bank, where a defender's silhouette was visible against the open ground, but from a position 8 yards back and elevated, a slight rise in the frozen earth that offered concealment without sacrificing the angle. Third, he moved himself. He had been observing from the same position for nearly 24 hours. A scout who had approached within 30 yards and studied the outpost's stillness would have logged that position. Miller relocated 11 yards northeast into a shallow depression he had not used previously and covered his former position with a section of gray canvas from a discarded shelter half. In low light, from a distance, it would read as an occupied fighting position. From close range, it would read as exactly what it was. But close range was not where he intended to let anyone get. None of these changes required additional men or equipment. All of them were reversible. He made them quietly, without explanation, to the full squad, and then resumed observation. A German mortar round landed 22 yards east of the outpost. Then a second, 18 yards north. No third round followed. It was not a fire mission. It was a ranging adjustment. Someone, somewhere behind the tree line, was bracketing the position with just enough precision to confirm they had its coordinates. They were not ranging for a mortar strike. They were ranging for what came after a mortar strike. Miller looked at the 2 impact craters for a moment. The adjustment between the first and second round was deliberate. 4 yards closer, slightly left. Whoever was doing the ranging knew what they were doing. He was not dealing with a standard infantry element executing a textbook probe. He was dealing with experienced soldiers who had fought this kind of war before and were applying that experience systematically. The margin that had existed on the first night, the gap between what the Germans knew and what they didn't, had narrowed considerably. By nightfall on December 17th, it had nearly closed. And then it closed entirely. Because that night, the Germans stopped probing and started pushing. Not with movement, with sound. Specifically, with the sound of a man calling out in accented English from the northeastern tree line. Approximately 70 yards out, beyond effective aimed fire in the dark. The words were clear, deliberately clear. He identified himself as an American soldier, separated from his unit, requesting the position's location to orient himself. Miller did not respond. He passed the no-fire signal down the line and held everyone still. The voice continued for approximately 90 seconds, cycling through variations of the same request. Unit designation, direction to the nearest American lines, any response at all. It was a competent performance. The accent was imperfect but serviceable. And in the dark, at distance, with men who had been awake for over 36 hours, it was exactly the kind of ambiguity that produces hesitation. Hesitation produces sound. Sound produces location. Miller had identified the tactic within the first 15 seconds. He had heard about it. German infiltrators using English-speaking soldiers to draw responses from American positions. In a divisional intelligence brief 3 weeks prior. He had filed it. Now he used it. He did not silence the voice by firing at it. He silenced it by giving it nothing to work with. After 4 minutes, the calling stopped. What replaced it was more concerning, because what replaced it was nothing at all. Complete stillness from the northeast. Miller immediately looked south. He was right to. At 2,204 hours, the drainage ditch erupted. 4 German soldiers, moving fast and low, crossed the open ground from the southeast at a dead sprint, not probing, not ranging, but committing. The bait from the northeast had been designed to fix his attention in one direction, while the real push came from the other. It was a clean piece of tactical deception, and against a less prepared position it would have worked. Against this position, it ran directly into the crossfire corridor Miller had constructed that afternoon. The engagement lasted less than 40 seconds. 2 of the 4 Germans were hit in the first exchange. The remaining 2 withdrew into the ditch. Miller's squad had fired from concealed positions that did not correspond to any location the Germans had previously observed. No one on Miller's side was hit. But the engagement had done something Miller could not prevent. It had confirmed the position's exact location, its approximate strength, and, critically, the fact that it was not going to be talked out, lured out, or rushed without resistance. The Germans now had the information they had been working to collect since the scouts first approached 24 hours earlier. The duel phase had begun in earnest. The mortar came back. This time it was not ranging. 3 rounds, tight grouping, walking directly toward the outpost from the northeast. Miller had moved his men off their primary positions the moment the first tube report echoed through the tree line. The rounds landed on empty ground. 2 foxholes were partially collapsed by the blasts. Neither was occupied. He had anticipated it. But anticipation has a cost. The men were now displaced from their prepared positions, in the dark, on ground they had not pre-selected, with a German infantry element in the drainage ditch 40 yards south and an unknown force in the tree line to the northeast. The carefully constructed geometry of the position, the crossfire corridors, the elevated southern watch, the false position covered with canvas, had been partially disrupted by the need to move. Miller had 11 minutes before the next likely approach. He used 8 of them to reposition his men into a tighter perimeter, pulling the 2 flanking elements in by 4 yards each and consolidating the ammunition, which was no longer abundant, into a central point from which he could redistribute as needed. He assessed his remaining rifle ammunition at approximately 60%. Grenades, 4 remaining across the squad. 1 BAR, the Browning automatic rifle, with 2 magazines left. He told the BR gunner, Private Sims, to hold both magazines until he gave a direct order to fire. He told him specifically, "Not when you think it's time. When I tell you." Sims acknowledged. On December 18th, a German soldier walked directly into the false position, the gray canvas over the abandoned northeast foxhole, and fired 3 rounds into it at close range. The sound of it was loud, sudden, and deliberate. It was designed to trigger a response from wherever Miller had relocated, a flinch, a turned head, a redirected weapon. Miller did not move. He watched the soldier stand over the empty position for a moment. Then he watched him raise a signal lamp toward the tree line. 1 flash, a pause, 2 flashes. He was reporting the position clear. That was a mistake, not Miller's, the German soldiers. Because a man signaling a tree line with a lamp is a man whose attention is directed away from his immediate surroundings, and Miller was 11 yards away. He did not fire. He let the soldier withdraw, because the signal had told him something more valuable than 1 less German in the field. It told him there was a command element in that tree line, someone receiving reports, processing them, and making decisions, which meant the next move would not be another probe. It would be a committed assault, ordered by someone who now believed the primary defensive position had been abandoned. The hunter had spent 48 hours becoming 1 move left to make it count. Miller had 1 move left to make it count. Miller had 4 grenades, a BAR with 2 magazines, 6 rifles at roughly 60% ammunition, and 7 men who had not slept in over 30 hours. The German element in the tree line believed the primary defensive position was abandoned. They had a signal lamp report confirming it. They had mortar fire that had walked directly through the position without triggering a response. From their perspective, the outpost had either withdrawn or been neutralized. Miller understood exactly what they believed. He had constructed that belief deliberately, across 48 hours, through a sequence of decisions that individually appeared to be restraint and collectively constituted a plan. Now, he had to decide what to do with it. The obvious move was to use the Germans' false confidence to set an ambush, draw them into the open ground, trigger the bar at close range, inflict maximum casualties, and use the confusion to withdraw toward friendly lines under cover of the engagement. It was a reasonable plan. It was the plan a competent soldier would devise. It was also, Miller assessed, exactly what a German infantry commander would expect a cornered position to attempt. He did not do the obvious thing. He sat with the decision for 11 minutes. This is documented, not because anyone timed it, but because 2 separate survivors noted in their after-action statements that Miller did not speak or move for what felt like a very long time after the German soldier withdrew. One of them, Private Hauk, wrote that he had assumed Miller was trying to stay awake. He was not. He was working through a problem that had more layers than the immediate tactical situation, and he was working through it carefully because he understood that the next decision could not be undone. The problem was this: an ambush in the open ground would work once. It would inflict casualties, create confusion, and buy time. But it would also confirm the position's location with absolute precision, expend the bar magazines and most of the remaining grenades, and leave 7 exhausted men in a known position with degraded ammunition, waiting for a coordinated response from a force that had already demonstrated it could adapt quickly. The ambush would feel like a victory. It would functionally be a last stand. Miller did not want a last stand. He wanted a tomorrow. He identified 3 elements of the German plan that were working in his favor, and he constructed his response around all 3 simultaneously. The first was position assumption. The German element believed the outpost had moved or withdrawn. That belief would shape their approach. They would move with more confidence, less dispersion, faster. Faster movement through open ground at night. By soldiers who believe the ground is clear, produces noise, and silhouette, it turns the approaching force into the observable element and the defender into the observer. Miller intended to stay in that relationship as long as possible. The second was the command element in the tree line. A commander receiving reports and directing movement is a commander who is managing information, not watching ground. His attention is distributed. His response time to unexpected developments is slower than a forward soldier's, because he is processing more variables. Miller could not neutralize that commander directly, but he could feed him information that would slow his decision cycle at the critical moment. The third was the drainage ditch. 2 German soldiers had withdrawn into it after the failed rush. Miller assessed they were still there, holding position, waiting for the assault order that would come once the tree line element was ready to move. The ditch was the southern anchor of the German plan. It was also the element the German commander was most confident about because it had not been engaged since the initial contact. He would expect it to perform as a fixing element, to pin Miller's attention south while the main approach came from the northeast across the open ground. Miller intended to let it. He pulled his 2 southernmost men off the ditch entirely and moved them to reinforce the northeastern corridor. He left the southern exposure uncovered, not because he was abandoning it, but because he needed the German commander to receive confirmation, when the assault began, that the southern element was advancing without resistance. That confirmation would accelerate the northeastern advance. It would compress the German timeline. And a compressed timeline, against a prepared position, means soldiers moving faster than their training, in tighter groups, through ground they believe is undefended. He then repositioned the BAR to a point he had not used before, a shallow angle from the northwest corner of the perimeter oriented to fire across the open ground from left to right rather than directly into the northeastern approach. The distinction was precise and intentional. A weapon firing directly into an approach can be located by muzzle flash and suppressed. A weapon firing across an approach, raking it laterally, is harder to fix, harder to suppress, and catches a moving column in its longest dimension rather than its narrowest. He explained this to Sims in approximately 40 words. Sims repositioned without comment. The last element of the decision was the most restrained and the most difficult. Miller instructed his men that when the assault came, the first soldiers to cross into the open ground were not to be engaged. He told them to hold fire until the lead element had committed fully, until they were past the point where withdrawal was faster than advance. This required his men to remain motionless while armed soldiers moved toward them in the dark. It required them to trust a calculation they could not verify. It required, from men who had not slept in 30 hours and had been under intermittent fire for 2 days, a degree of discipline that had no name in any field manual. He told them the timing was everything. He told them once. Then he went back to his position. At 0148 hours, the tree line went quiet in a specific way. The way it goes quiet when men in it are no longer observing but moving. Miller recognized the difference. He passed the 2-click signal. 7 men settled into stillness. The open ground to the northeast remained empty for 4 minutes. Then it wasn't. What crossed that open ground in the next 90 seconds would put everything Miller had built, every repositioned man, every withheld shot, every patient decision, to its final test. 11 German soldiers crossed the open ground. They moved in 2 loose files, fast and low, northeast to southwest. Directly across the lane, Miller had repositioned the BAR to cover. They were not dispersed. They were confident. The lead element was already 2/3 across the open ground before the trailing file had fully cleared the tree line. Exactly what compressed timelines produce. Exactly what Miller had anticipated. He waited until the lead element passed the midpoint. Then he said one word to Sims. The bar opened laterally across the open ground and did not stop until the first magazine was empty. Miller's 6 riflemen engaged simultaneously from the northeastern corridor, not at the open ground, but at the tree line, suppressing the command element before it could process what was happening and redirect. To the south, the drainage ditch element began moving as expected, advancing without resistance, interpreting the silence as confirmation that the southern flank was clear. They covered 12 yards before Miller redirected 2 riflemen to engage it. The entire engagement lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. When it was over, the open ground held 7 German soldiers who would not be filing any more reports. The ditch element had withdrawn. The tree line had gone silent. Not the tactical silence of men repositioning, but the deeper silence of a force that has lost its command coherence and is waiting for orders that are no longer coming. Miller did an ammunition count. 4 rifle rounds remained per man on average. 1 BAR magazine, no grenades. He held the position until first light. A relief element from the 394th reached the outpost. They had been dispatched not because command knew the position was under pressure. Communication had been restored only partially, but because a routing adjustment had brought a platoon within range and their lieutenant had decided to check the forward positions. What they found was 7 men, alive, in a position that showed evidence of sustained engagement across 2 nights. Empty casings distributed across multiple firing points. Boot prints and frozen mud documenting approaches from 3 directions, 7 impact craters from mortar rounds, none of them centered on an occupied position. The lieutenant walked the perimeter quietly. He did not say much. Miller's after-action statement was 3 pages. Factual, sequential, no embellishment. It documented the German approach patterns, the adaptation timeline, the repositioning decisions, and their rationale. It was, by the assessment of the intelligence officer who reviewed it, one of the more useful tactical documents produced from a junior NCO position during the entire Ardennes campaign. Miller was promoted to sergeant 8 days later. The citation was 4 lines. It noted sustained defensive action, preservation of a forward position under repeated assault, and, in the final line, sound judgment under adverse conditions. 4 words for 48 hours. He accepted the promotion without comment, returned to his unit, continued the work. The men who had been there, the ones who had called him the Watcher, who had redirected his suggestions, who had placed him at a low-priority outpost because no one had a stronger reason to put him somewhere else, those men did not speak about it often. But they did not call him the Watcher anymore. Some things don't need to be said to be understood. A corporal with no radio, no armor, no reinforcement, and a squad of 7 men held a forward position for 48 hours against a German force that adapted, regrouped, and committed. And not one of his men died doing it. The question worth sitting with isn't whether Joe Miller was a great soldier. The question is, how many Joe Millers did the Army overlook and never gave a position to find out?